Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'll just give it a minute here while people get, logged in and connected. Hopefully you can hear us and see us. If you have any questions at all, tech-wise, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will help you out when I finish this brief introduction here and we'll get it figured out. Okay, thank you all for joining us. My name's Samantha Hooker. I'll be the moderator for today's Eval Cafe. The cafe is a long-standing speaker series hosted by the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The goal of the series is to encourage a deeper dive into all things evaluation, so we're very glad you can join us today. In a few minutes, I'll add a link to the chat. That will give you the option to join our mailing list if you want to stay in the loop about upcoming presentations we have. I'll also put a link in there for the schedule for the rest of our spring series. So we have two more presentations in April. Before we begin, we do want to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the land that we're located on. Western Michigan University is on the lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, which was historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Badmadmi nations. We honor their stewardship and connection to the land. Today, we're very excited to be joined by Aaron Cates. He is the lead evaluation consultant of EffectX. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can use the reaction button to raise your hand. You can also go ahead and enter them in the chat, and I will keep track of those for when we get to question breaks. So thank you for joining us, and I will pass it to Aaron.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, everyone who's here in person and online. I'm so happy to be back at my home institution here where I got my PhD a few years back to talk about trauma-informed evaluation, formerly trauma-informed evaluation and research, as it is titled in our forthcoming book from Guilford Press, which I've worked with Dr. Martha Brown on as well. So she wasn't able to be here today, but I'm happy to stand in and do this for both of us. So this should be coming out in mid to late summer. So if you're interested in updates on that, we can perhaps you can send me an email and I can get you on a list about that. So let's dive in. So today's agenda, first I'll be talking about what is trauma-informed evaluation, what are the theoretical foundations and positioning of trauma-informed evaluation and research, what do we see in terms of trauma in the evaluation literature, and then 5 things that I want evaluators to know to take forward in their trauma-informed work. So first of all, what is trauma-informed evaluation? In our book, we define it as trauma-informed evaluation applies SAMHSA, that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the federal government of the United States. So we apply SAMHSA's trauma-informed principles to help evaluators acknowledge and minimize potential trauma while maintaining methodological rigor within their chosen evaluation design. So we are introducing this as a lens. This is not a standalone model competing for space in your evaluation toolkit. We apply SAMHSA's trauma-informed principles to evaluation practice. We advocate that we integrate it with other approaches. We don't advocate for it as a standalone model. We advocate for its universal application in evaluation and research practice. So
Aaron,
what are these 6 principles? Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We had someone in the chat who said the sound is a little bit low. I've noticed that on my end as well, and I don't know
Okay.
if you could get a little closer to the mic or any adjustments on your end.
Sure. Yeah, I can
But
try
I
that.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. How is that? Is that any better?
Yeah, that sounds better to me.
Okay. All right. Okay, so what are the six principles that SAMHSA has put forth? So their first principle is safety. We want to ensure that when we are working with traumatized populations, that we are ensuring psychological and physical safety. We don't want to re-traumatize. We don't want to do any other psychological harm in the course of our work. Trust and transparency. We need to make sure that the people that we're working with can take our word for what we are telling them. This involves good practices around informed consent, and how we conduct ourselves throughout our evaluation research processes. So the principle of peer support means allowing those with trauma to be able to support one another, and this includes allowing people to engage in ways that they find helpful with other folks in the community. Collaboration and mutuality. We need to ensure that people feel empowered, and that we are not doing things to them, but with them in a collaborative process. Related to that is empowerment, voice, and choice. We have a lot of history in the United States and globally of research and evaluation that has taken advantage of people and limited their ability to make their own choices and to be empowered. And then the cultural, historical, and gender issues that have been longstanding in our society. These need to be addressed head on in order to be able to move forward and limit traumatization in the future. So SAMHSA also has established these 4 R's for trauma-informed approach. That's realize, understand trauma's widespread impact on individuals, families, systems. Recognize, identify signs and symptoms of trauma. Respond, integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. Resist re-traumatization, the baseline ethical imperative, do no harm. And then we added our 5th, which is resilience, move beyond do no harm toward actively fostering healing. We advocate that we don't just resist re-traumatization, but think about ways that we are actually advancing resilience and healing with every action that we are taking in our communities. So we have this wonderful evaluation flower that this is based off of a few of our friends here at the Evaluation Center. So Daniela Schroeder and Alyssa Becho worked with Bianca Montrose Moorhead to create the evaluation garden. And so this is our evaluation flower that we created specifically for trauma-informed evaluation and research. You'll see that the specific emphasis for TIER is on power dynamics and making evaluation decisions, context, activism for social justice, and engagement in the evaluation process. These are the areas that we focus most on in our work. You'll see that there's values and valuing and promoting use and depth of engagement. Those rely a lot on the other evaluation approaches that you may be integrating with trauma-informed practice that may determine how that actually looks in your practice. So those largest petals there, those are our main focus. So let's talk about trauma in the evaluation literature. So one of the things that I did for the book was a substantial literature review so that I had a leg to stand on in terms of what is trauma in the evaluation literature, how are people actually engaging in the topic that framed the work that we did together in the book. So we took a corpus, all articles from 14 evaluation-focused journals, and all the articles that contained the word trauma, and we found 400 articles from the beginning of these evaluation journals. This was all articles up till 2023, I think, was when this stopped. And then we coded ultimately 343 articles after exclusions were were applied. So then finally, we conducted thematic coding and deductive coding against SAMHSA's 6 principles. So this allowed us to both show how SAMHSA's 6 principles either were or were not reflected in the discourse around trauma, and then it also allowed us to explore in an open-ended way how trauma was treated in the literature. We found a pretty massive uptick in the references to trauma, starting in the late teens and ramping up into the 2020s. It would be interesting to go back and do this for 24 and 25 and 26 and see if this trend is continuing. I imagine it would be. So what sorts of patterns did we find? We found that early references have show a narrow understanding of trauma. This is especially in the 70s and 80s. They would mainly focus on military post-traumatic stress disorder, medical trauma. So it's kind of a very narrow understanding of what trauma is and where it would be seen. Later references demonstrate a more holistic understanding of trauma as something that is potentially pervasive of society, something that potentially people other than just soldiers or people in accidents could experience. We see it treated with more nuance, certainly as time went on. So the dominant patterns, we found 46 articles that really meaningfully engage with trauma. Most of the other ones, those 300 and some odd that we categorized, were really just kind of like one-off acknowledgments of trauma existing, or it's potentially an important factor, but only 46 really meaningfully engaged with it in any way. 72 articles were just kind of descriptions of an evaluation that happened in a trauma-focused program, but these did not necessarily address any trauma-informed evaluation practices specifically. So only 14% of the articles involving traumatized populations specifically reference trauma-informed practices. So we see it really getting short shrift in a lot of places. So the common pattern is that trauma is often acknowledged, but trauma-informed methods are not really clearly described. And so you'll see when we categorized these 46 articles that really engaged in any meaningful way, they were really focused on safety. 50%, 57% of the mentions were focused on safety, avoiding re-traumatizing people, and then close runner-up to that was cultural, historical, and gender issues. And then the other 4 principles were really not well covered in the literature. So that's one of the things that we sought to do with the book, is make sure that we are covering all 6 of these principles well as we were going through our work. So trauma in the evaluation literature, what persistent issues did we see? We saw a real focus on safety, cultural, historical, and gender issues, with short shrift to some other relevant topics. We saw an understanding of trauma that is heavily influenced by pop psychology and cultural narratives. You'll see a little bit more of what I mean as I go through some of these tips, what I want evaluators to know about trauma. So number 1, what I want you to know is that you are already working with traumatized people, almost surely, right? Whether you were working with disabled veterans, whether you're working with some other sort of social service system, or even if you're only working with other academics, you are surely working with traumatized people. That's because we know that there's a 64% prevalence of US adults who have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. So I don't know if all of you have heard of the Kaiser Permanente study from the 1990s that studied adverse childhood experiences and its effects on people's thriving in adulthood and onward. So we know that about 2/3 of people have experienced something like homelessness, the mental illness of a parent, injury, or witnessing death or near death of a loved one. All this sort of thing. We also have an expanding definition of trauma. It seems that more and more we are recognizing more and more ways that trauma can be seen and experienced. We know that there's about a 90% prevalence of adults with past trauma. So that 2/3 was people who experienced trauma in childhood, but once you reach adulthood, about 90% of people have had something in their past. So number two, and I think this is one of the misconceptions that we're seeing a lot in the trauma literature is in the evaluation literature is some of the imprecision when we're talking about re-traumatization. And I think that it's getting perhaps causing a little bit of unnecessary fear around trauma. Is just this concept of re-traumatization and what is it? I think this comes a lot from pop psychology. And if we look at how the field talks about it, many scholars are talking about it in terms of reactivation from talking about or being reminded of trauma, or simply just being upset in the course of talking about something unpleasant or upsetting, right? But how trauma scholars talk about re-traumatization is very specific. It specifically refers to experiencing multiple traumatic events and then worsening traumatic symptoms after that. Okay. So the only book on re-traumatization specifically talks about re-traumatization this way. We define re-traumatization as traumatic stress reactions, responses, and symptoms that occur consequent to multiple exposures to traumatic events that are physical, psychological, or both in nature. This can occur in the context of repeated multiple exposures within one category of events or multiple exposures across different categories of events. Such multiple exposures increase the duration, frequency, and intensity of distress reactions. So when we're talking about re-traumatization, most of the time what we're talking about is this concept of being triggered or reactivated. That's likely to be more common, right? So instead of talking about re-traumatization, yes, we want to limit that, but we also need to define and talk about these other forms of what is just triggering, right? So triggering would be something reminds you, a sight, a sound, a smell reminds you of a past experience, and that causes perhaps some emotional flooding, some discomfort, an emotive reaction, right? That's very different from re-traumatization, okay? And that, especially if we're implementing good safety practices, should be quite rare, okay? Number three, participating in research and evaluation can be legitimately empowering for people. One of the best articles that I've found about re-traumatization and the research and evaluation experience is from a scholar named Weiss, who looked at trauma-informed political science research and did a really great systematic review and looked at rates of discomfort, distress, re-traumatization in research work. And she finds that there's an overwhelming pattern of perceived benefit from research participation, with low levels of participation regret, less than 5% in the course of most studies. And that's just regret. That's not even, measuring a level of discomfort or let alone re-traumatization. In many cases, participants use any source of distress as a source of healing. Okay. So we need to be making sure that we're not in an unfounded way, cutting people out from the research process who could actually find benefit and agency in the process. Number four, and this is something to be really cognizant of, is cutting off emotional expression can be harmful. Okay. So when we're talking about engaging with people who have been traumatized, and we think that we are likely to encounter some difficult emotions, what we need to do is we need to conduct our safety planning with our team. So this means making sure that, are we likely to encounter people who are going to be distressed and need some crisis help? We should have those numbers available. I've heard that in some evaluations, people might include an actual therapeutic staff on site to actually be able to speak to people. Those are all great things to do. Frequent emotional check-ins during your interviews, asking questions like, how are you doing? Would you like to continue? If you see that somebody is emoting, being able to check in with them and ask them if they are okay with continuing, right? Say, I can recognize that this is really difficult for you to talk about. Are you able to continue? Ensuring autonomy, making sure that there is ongoing consent, right? Informed consent is not something that just happens once and then you move on from. There must be consistent, enthusiastic affirmation of that informed consent going forward. So some things to avoid when thinking about ensuring emotional safety. You really should not enter this sort of work unless you know that you are pretty comfortable with strong emotions, right? If somebody is crying there with you, being able to sit with that and without showing disapproval or discomfort with their strong emotions. We need to avoid stopping emotional reactions, right? If somebody is crying and they're telling you something, it can be perceived as shaming to say like, oh, I'm not equipped for this. I can't hear about this, right? So it's really important to come to this work having developed your own sort of emotional safety and coping mechanisms. For instance, if you know that you've been through something similar to what your participants might be talking about, and that triggers you and you're not able to self-regulate, that may be a reason to not participate in that specific data collection activity. Okay. What to avoid as well would be including participants in active trauma situations. So one of the articles in our review talked about the complications for involving people who are in like an active war situation, or people who might be in an ongoing domestic violence situation. Those might be situations where the person is likely not in a state to be able to speak about what they're going through in a stable way. So as evaluators, we really should probably be leaving active situations alone, right? And then number five, what I want people to know is don't throw out your favorite approach. I think that one of the things that we really set out to do with this book was ensure that people can take the 6 principles and apply them to the work that they are doing at present, right? I think that most of the approaches out there are going to be adaptable, right? This is not about, oh, we have special analysis tools for you, or we have special protocols for you. No, this is about developing the critical thinking to be able to take what you know and apply the 6 principles to what you are doing. And that takes me to the end, and I'm ready for questions and discussion. And this is where you can reach me, Aaron@effectx.com. And this QR code should take you to our website as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Aaron. And I just want to remind everybody, you can go ahead and raise your hand, come off mute, pop a question in the chat. We did have one during your presentation, wondering if there is a questionnaire for adulthood that's similar to the ACE questionnaire for childhood. like adverse adult experience?
Uh, I mean, I know of similar. There's like there's a Stanford it's a Stanford PTSD assessment, which that'll include like all of the um, all of the standard recognized trauma incidents. I don't know of like an adult corollary to the childhood. There may be one, but ACEs are generally considered to be their own thing, and then once you reach adulthood, it's just traumatic instances in adulthood. Um, but you can find there's lots of lists out there, and I think kind of our conception of what is or is not trauma is definitely expanding. And so I think there's the DSM is about to get a new update, and that should have a new updated list in there. So I think all you would really need would be just like a basic count of those for people. So we have another one.
Yes. Linda says that she works with low-income populations
Mm-hmm.
and thinks that being pelted with questions is itself a type of trauma, because they're continually faced with questionnaires, forms,
Mm-hmm.
etc. So just wondering, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that it's definitely like in clinical treatment they talk about like the least invasive or the least restrictive environment for a person. And I think similarly, when we're collecting data, we need to be doing the least intensive form of data collection that would be viable for the project, right? We should not be asking things that are unnecessary to know, right? Because yeah, there could be a lot of fatigue, a lot of stress that can be created for a person for, yeah, pelting someone with questions, right? When I was working with refugee youth, one of the first things that I would have to do would be do these huge assessments. They all had to be done within 24 hours. That was not very trauma informed. It was based on legislation that wanted to reduce risk, right? So we need to ask all these questions within 24 hours, including, sexual history, gang history, all of this stuff that really was not appropriate to be asking a youth. Um, you know, 100 plus questions about really sensitive stuff within 24 hours. So like we need to figure out the least intrusive way to get what we need to do our research.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Chad is wondering, is there data on relationships between adult trauma and suicide, like an ACE score of 4 or above?
I don't know specifically. I mean, I know that PTSD does certainly raise your level of suicidality. And the more trauma instances, certainly the more likely you are to have a PTSD diagnosis.
Okay. In the articles you included in your study, did you separate articles that mention trauma related to the type of program evaluation versus trauma-informed research slash evaluation practices?
Um, you state that again. So
Oh,
what
sure.
was
So in the articles that you included in your study, just wondering if you separated the articles that mention trauma related to the type of program evaluation versus trauma-informed research evaluation practices.
um it wasn't it wasn't separated out by, like, are you asking like if there was a program description um versus an actual description of trauma informed practices? I guess I'm having trouble with the framing of the question. Is there a way to restate that?
Yes, Lori, would you mind coming off mute or just popping a clarification into the chat?
Hey, you caught me off
Okay.
guard. I was trying to solve a technical problem on my side, but I do remember what I asked. So, in the articles, I was actually really surprised at how many articles made the cut from the 400, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my question was like, when you were search for the keyword of trauma, right? when then you dove in and looked at those, did you do any separation of ones that like
Yeah.
were in the literature, like we evaluated this whatever trauma treatment program or this PTSD program or this domestic violence prevention program versus here's like an article about how we use trauma
Yep.
informed methodology? Was there a distinguishing of those kinds of topics?
You froze for like 45 seconds.
Oh no, Lori, I can hear you the
I'm
whole
so
time.
sorry.
Oh, okay, I'll say it again. Are you ready?
Thank
Okay.
you.
So there was like I think you found 400 articles.
Yes.
So my question is, did you separate out ones that were focused on like, we evaluated this program that,
Uh-huh.
engages people that have experienced trauma versus articles that maybe really focused on trauma-informed methods and talking about that
Yes.
aspect of the work?
Yes. So that was like the 70 some that mentioned like, oh, this is a program dealing with like traumatized populations, right? And the vast majority of those did not cover any sort of trauma informed approaches taken, right? Does that make sense? Like there would have been some overlap, but those 76 articles were like just mentions that it was a traumatized population, but no trauma informed principles involved. Does that make sense?
You got a thumbs up.
Okay.
Okay, Erin. Next up, I wonder how we align these comments on pelting people with questions in a participatory evaluation methodology. I definitely agree that the amount of assessment and evaluation needs to be balanced, but curious if folks have thoughts on involving people in more participatory evaluation contexts.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's all about uh, you know, do people feel like evaluation is a thing being done to them, or do they feel like legitimate participants in it, right? I mean, one of our largest pedals is the participation pedal because we want people to be involved uh, at all levels of the evaluation if they want to, right? We want people to be consulted, so their values should be included and not feel like this is something being done to them, right? So if they can help drive the process, that's going to enhance the voice and choice and empowerment aspect, right? So I don't know if anybody else has like any practical ideas for that. But at the base level is asking people who are part of the population you're working with to review your instruments, asking them to help design the instruments if you have access to them, right?
Okay, thank you. Amy is curious if you have any suggestions for trauma-informed evaluation practices that consider the impact of trauma exposure on researchers and evaluators and avoiding possible secondary trauma.
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole chapter on secondary trauma in the book. And one of these is first acknowledging that it's a real thing. Stacy Huff is a researcher who just did her dissertation on secondary trauma in evaluators. And so I think that the first step is going to be um, acknowledging it, right? So that we can actually create this network of mutual support among evaluators and actually give voice to it and start talking about it, right? We can't deal with it if it's swept under the rug, right?
Okay, and Erin, are your inclusion exclusions written up somewhere, like in text or somewhere else?
Yeah, they're in the book.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
cool. All right. You mentioned the importance of researchers and evaluators being emotionally prepared, stable to work with those who have experienced trauma. Given that at least some researchers and evaluators have likely experienced ACEs and AAEs based on the prevalence data you shared, and that working with traumatized populations can be emotional in itself, can you talk about approaches and or strategies for researchers and evaluators to emotionally prepare?
Yeah,
which
therapy is great. I've done my fair bit of it. And it's, I have a few aces myself. And I think that was really important for me, going through that process. Especially childhood trauma, I think has the deepest impact because that really shapes your outlook as you go forward into adulthood. So working with somebody who's really, really good at that, especially if you know that you're stepping in a situation that deals specifically with the similar kind of trauma that you experience, that's when it's going to be the most serious for you, right? So if you experience medical trauma and then you're going to go into a situation and be interviewing other people with medical trauma, you want to make sure that you're in a situation so that people aren't going to trigger you and then you can't uh, follow through with the interview, right? That could actually be damaging to that person, if they feel that, oh, it's not safe to talk about this thing, right? um, so yeah, and then I think being open with your team about that, and acknowledging that if that's in that, and as evaluation is a team sport, we should be able to hopefully be that honest with the people that we're working with. So I don't think you need to get specific, but I think we should be open if there's something going on that would limit our ability to handle that in a healthy way. The name of the book is Trauma Informed Evaluation and Research, and it's from Guilford Press, and you probably won't find a listing yet. That's why you're not seeing it. I just saw somebody asked a question about where to find it. So I'll put up my slide of what the cover looks like again here, so you can see that.
And Aaron, you said that's coming out this summer, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
That's from Guilford Press. You see that? That's the cover
Yes.
there. Any other questions?
Yes. Can you speak more about the findings you mentioned that participation in research or evaluation can be empowering or healing for people who have experienced trauma?
Sure. Yeah, I think that, one of the I spoke a little bit about how a lot of the evaluation literature is um, appears to me to be heavily influenced by pop psychology, right? And kind of the way that pop psychology these days talks about trauma is almost like, well, once you go through trauma, this is a damaging thing, and then therefore, after that, you need to be handled with kid gloves, right? And I think there's, in the book, I talk about what's the difference between sensitivity, insensitivity, and hypersensitivity, right? And I think right now the culture is on the hypersensitivity end of the pendulum, right? In some circles, there's some insensitivity going on as well. But how do we calibrate it to where we are being sensitive, right? And that's actually the best. It's actually the best for people, right? I say Eval Cafe has raised a hand. Is there an issue, or can I keep going here?
No issue, just a question. Hi, this is
Okay.
Lissa Betcho in
Hi,
the Room at the
Lisa.
Evaluation Center. I thank you for this presentation. I'm really excited to see the book when it comes out. I was wondering if you could tell us a story or an example, either from your own work or maybe that's in the book, about how following trauma-informed practices really made a big difference in the evaluation.
Yes, I'd love to. So I was in the middle. I'm going to answer the rest of Lori's question here, but yes, we see that kind of in culture, the impulse is to let's make sure to not mention trauma, or let's mention it and center it as this big scary thing, right? But in the research we see that um, people can actually be helped better through trauma by not always being in this avoidance mode, right? So it's there's this kind of like healthy window that we want to be in, right? Where it's like we're giving people empowerment, choice to engage with their trauma when they feel safe, when they want to, but we're not just like excluding them from research, right? There were multiple articles that I found where people were just like, oh, well, we decided not to speak to this population because they're traumatized, right? And I think that's what we really want to avoid is just like cutting people out of the evaluation process because of their trauma status, right? I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that's helpful, right? And I think a lot of the discourse in the public sphere around trauma has kind of sent the message that like, well, you're traumatized, so we can't talk to you about this, right? I don't think that's good. I don't think that's right. And I don't think that's helpful. Right. And in fact, the research I think does demonstrate that like allowing people in a safe place to talk about these things can be beneficial, right, to all involved. So as far as being trauma informed in your evaluation and how that leads to good better outcomes, better evaluation. You know, I'm convinced that when we are able to provide a safe and open place for people to share difficult things, we do understand the nature of what they're going through better, right? I think people are more willing to be open with us. I mean, as far as like a specific story, I mean, I can remember multiple times where you know, I've been speaking with evaluation participants, and I know that I've made them feel safe. They're able to cry, right? They're able to share a difficult story, and I know that we've had a real connection, and I think I've understood them better because we're able to get in an emotional space where we feel safe in that. So as far as like a specific story, you know, I don't I would just say that I've experienced that multiple times with people that I've worked with. So one of the most recent ones was a woman who was going through real grief, and through her sharing her grief with me was actually able to um, kind of express to me what this particular program meant to her, right? So I think there could be a lot of meaning conveyed that can really contribute to both the evaluative process, but it can kind of help the person as well um, realize how their engagement with this program has been helpful for them as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, Lissa. Um, Anything else?
Yes, just a quick question. You mentioned pop psychology a couple of times, so just a
Mhm.
clarification on what you mean when you say pop psychology.
Yep. Yeah. So I would say like a lot of discussion about trauma in the media. Again, one of the most common mentions about trauma and safety was the idea of re-traumatization, right? And one of the most common ways they talk about that is just feeling uncomfortable, right? Clinically, that is not considered re-traumatization, right? Like I discussed. And that comes a lot from like, you know, podcasters talking about what trauma is, or articles that might talk about what trauma is. So, you know, a lot of TV, a lot of popular self-help books talk about trauma in ways that aren't really in line with the clinical definitions of what trauma is. So yeah, pop psychology is what I would consider anything that's coming from, um, you know, non psychological, non medical sources about trauma that maybe are based more on folk psychology or folk understandings of trauma and how it works. That's less research based.
Okay, thank you. Are there indigenous approaches or authors in your book?
So we engage with the work of Begele Chalisa, um, Nikki Bowman. So they're all people that we reference and draw from in our book, and definitely point people towards those resources. We don't try to really take on the voice of Indigenous populations in our book, but we certainly point people towards those sorts of resources for sure.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we have a
Mhm.
question in the Eval Cafe room.
Hey, Erin, it's Val. Can you hear
Hi,
me
Val.
okay?
I can.
Okay. One of my questions was, I know for trauma and grief, for example, like we often talk about how healing is not linear, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
from an evaluator's perspective, going into a program that's focused on trauma-informed care or doing some sort of grief work, that, thinking about the logic model of short-term outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and what can reasonably be expected in terms of like change in individual
Mm-hmm.
level outcomes. Did your research find anything about that, like in terms of how evaluators can support that change may not be happening as fast as a program wants or a funder wants or something?
Yeah, that's really a really interesting question. I don't think we looked at that specifically, but yeah, trauma and healing from trauma is going to be a very complex process. It's
Right,
probably not going to happen overnight. And even some of the most quote unquote evidence-based trauma therapies, like EMDR is all the rage right now. They do demonstrate like real efficacy, but not for all people and not for all people and not with the same levels of success with each person either, right?
right.
Um, so yeah, I don't know how much more I have to say other than yeah, that as evaluators, we would have to be sensitive to that sort of uneven success for different people, right?
Right.
Um, yeah, does that
Yeah,
answer your
yeah,
question?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think part of what I hear you saying is like that's also the importance of like disaggregating the data.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, in my analysis chapter, I talk about um, staying away from just measures of central tendency to
Mhm.
make judgments about how a population is doing with a particular intervention, because you may have a subset of people for which an intervention is actively harmful, right?
Yeah.
And so
That's a
we
great point,
want
actually. Yeah.
yeah, so we want to be able to identify those instances, and it's also why it's important to do qual work, and not just looking at our success cases, right?
Right. Yeah, right on. Thank you.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, and Erin, is there any chance that you have like a preview shot of your table of contents that you could share?
Uh, not not right now.
Okay.
No.
Well, the good news is people are really looking forward to your book.
Okay. Good.
Okay. That is all the questions that we have right now. I'm just going to give it, just a couple of seconds if anybody else wants to raise their hand or pop a question in the chat. Um, in the meantime, I'll go ahead and put the links to the Eval Cafe mailing list and our April schedule in there as well. There's also recordings to the videos in case you missed any of the January, February presentations. Okay. Well, it looks like you have answered all the questions. I want to thank you so much for your time, Erin. We really appreciate your presentation. You're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat. And we're glad that you were able to come here to Kalamazoo to join us too, on top of it all. So thank you
Great.
everybody for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.